So, good afternoon and welcome from me, Jonathan Hemus, Managing Director of Insignia. Thank you very much indeed for joining our last crisis management webinar of 2015. And today we are going to be talking about how to run a successful crisis simulation exercise. And the reason that we decided to focus the final webinar of the year on crisis simulations is really because it's something that I am personally very, very passionate about. Clearly, I would love everyone on this call to run a crisis simulation with Insignia'S support, but frankly, even if that isn't the case, if you choose to run the simulation yourself or even use one of our competitors, I believe so passionately that simulations are the most important part of crisis planning that it's something that I wanted to finish this year on, as I know you will all be going into your 2016 planning programs. So why? A little bit of context first. Why is a crisis simulation so important? Well, there's a great article which has recently appeared in Fast Company magazine. You can get the article online as well, and it's a really good read, and it's written by a lady called Kim Green, who is a pilot, and it's her 3 crisis management tips based on being a pilot. And I wanted to read to you 3 paragraphs from that article because I think it encapsulates why crisis simulations are just so important. She says, "When it's just you and your craft at 5,000 feet, what matters most is experience, especially when the weather turns inclement or the engine goes quiet. You can be a whiz at aerodynamics and know your equipment like an engineer, but it's how you react when everything goes wrong that shows what kind of pilot you really are. Business leaders face down everything from PR headaches to financial crises, and sometimes even threats to health and human life within their organizations. You can bring your A game to the boardroom and know your industry inside and out, but if you've never handled a major emergency, it's hard to know how well you'll fare when your first one hits. That's why pilots are trained in crisis management. We're taught to think through a range of potential mishaps, memorize checklists, and plot courses of action in advance. Executives can do the same." So, if it's good enough for pilots, I would suggest it's good enough for us. For a little bit more context, I wanted to look at 2 major incidents and consider how planning and rehearsal can literally sometimes mean the difference between life and death. 1977 saw one of the worst ever air disasters when on Tenerife, a KLM 747 collided with a Pan Am 747 on a runway in conditions of deep fog. The KLM jet took the roof off the Pan Am jet, leaving many of the passengers exposed to the elements. Only 68 people from those 2 aeroplanes survived that crash. 2 of the people on board the Pan Am jet were Floy and Paul Heck, a married couple. Floy Heck, in an interview subsequent to the incident, described her immediate reaction when she heard and felt that enormous jolt when the KLM 747 collided with the Pan Am 747. She said, "My mind was almost blank. I didn't even hear what was going on." In contrast, her husband Paul Heck responded instantly. He undid his seatbelt, he stood up, he ordered his wife to leave the plane, and they quickly walked down the aisle, out of the emergency exit, and onto a wing. As Floy Heck looked back, she described in her interview how she saw other passengers staring straight ahead of themselves with their arms comfortably folded in their lap, doing nothing. Paul and Floy jumped off the wing of the aircraft and were one of the 68 to survive that incident. Most of those that remained sitting in their seats on the plane perished. Why did Paul Heck respond so accurately and so quickly? Well, he had read the safety card. He always read the safety card on the aeroplane. He then looked for the nearest exit and planned how he would get out if there was an emergency. Therefore, when the event actually happened, he was able to work on automatic rather than having all of his brain functions closed down through what is known as an amygdala attack. The reason that he always did that on board every plane, indeed inside every building, was that as a child he had survived a theatre fire, and he knew that in the event of an emergency or a crisis, having a plan and having the calmness of mind to execute that plan is the only way that you can succeed. So, Floy and Paul Heck. Those of you who are students of crisis management and disaster management will probably already know the story of Rick Rescorla. Rick was the Director of Security for Morgan Stanley, based in the South Tower at the World Trade Center. Rick took his job incredibly seriously and was always thinking ahead as to what the next problem, the next crisis could be. Indeed, he predicted a truck bomb attack ahead of the actual truck bomb incident in 1993. In the aftermath of that attack, Rick was disquieted by the poor evacuation which took place when that event happened. And it made him redouble his focus on crisis management planning, and his staff at Morgan Stanley became sick and tired of the regular evacuation drills that Rick used to run. They rehearsed over and over and over again. As a consequence of those constant rehearsals, when the September the 11th attack happened, Rick and his colleagues were ready. Despite a PA announcement telling everybody to stay at their desks in the South Tower, Rick Rescorla knew that action was required, and the right action was to get out of that building as quickly as possible. And he ordered all staff to make an immediate evacuation. Because of the rehearsal, the Morgan Stanley staff knew exactly where to go, what to do, how to get out of the building. And over 2,700 Morgan Stanley employees escaped the South Tower. The sad truth is that Rick Rescorla himself perished in that horrific day. He was last seen near the 10th floor heading up to help more of his colleagues leave the building. It's an incredibly powerful tale of the value of planning ahead and the value of rehearsing, so that when the very worst happens, people do and say the right thing through that experience that they've had before. Bringing us right up to date, many of you will have observed the challenges that Thomas Cook have recently faced, indeed over the last 4 or 5 years, with the Corfu tragedy. Thomas Cook had been very broad-minded and very forward-looking in inviting Justin King, the man you see on this slide, to do a full review of its crisis management processes in the light of that incident. And as a slightly different point to the one that we're making on this webinar, the need to learn from crises and issues is a really important one, and one which many organisations fail to do. As soon as the incident is behind them, they figuratively brush it under the carpet and carry on with business as usual. So I really applaud Thomas Cook for having the courage, the foresight and the common sense to actually take the learnings out of what was a very challenging incident for them, to examine them and to commit to applying them within their organisation. And I would commend everybody who cares about crisis management to go to Thomas Cook's corporate website and download the entire Justin King report, because it has lessons and messages for everybody who cares about managing a crisis, not just Thomas Cook itself. It talks about the importance of creating the right culture. It talks about the criticality of empowering the front line so that your executives, your individuals on the front line can make the right decisions without having to go through 10 levels of approval. It talks about the importance of everybody owning health and safety, not just the health and safety department. But it also talks about the critical importance of crisis management training and regular simulations. So through the really tough experience of a major crisis, Thomas Cook is one of the organisations that has relearned the importance of crisis exercises to make sure that they are ready for any future incidents. And on a slightly lighter-hearted note, those of you who are golf fans will also know Gary Player's famous mantra, "The harder I practice, the luckier I get." So, as in all areas of our lives, practice really does make perfect, and nowhere is practice more important than in the field of crisis management. The advice of our friend the pilot, the experience of Floyd Heck, the example of Rick Rescorla, the wise words of Justin King and the mantra of Gary Player all underline the critical importance of simulations to help you do and say the right thing when the pressure is on. So, with that context set, let me move on to what we believe are some of the really critical principles for running a successful crisis simulation. And as always, please do send us any questions that you have during this webinar. We'll deal with them at the end, but by using your chat or question pane on your screen, please log those questions and we'll deal with as many of them as possible before we finish at round about 2 o'clock. So here are the key principles. The first one, and it really is the first one for a reason, is to be clear about the purpose of the simulation. We have persuaded clients not to do a simulation until the objectives for it were clear. So don't just do a simulation because you think it's a good idea. Do one against some very specific objectives. For example, do you have a new or significantly revised crisis management plan that you need your team to become acquainted with? Is there a new emerging risk which the organisation needs to walk through? And the one that lots of organisations are running exercises on at the moment is, of course, cybercrime. It's a big issue for all organisations, so maybe that is a good reason for running a crisis simulation. But more than having a reason, have very clear objectives. What do you want the outcomes of this exercise to be? Why are you doing it? And then everything that flows on from that can play into achieving your objectives. So just doing a simulation isn't good enough. Work out why, work out the objectives, work out what the purpose, the rationale of the exercise is. The second thing is, we talk very broadly about simulations, but there are different kinds of exercises which can be applied to help rehearse your team. And consider carefully which is the appropriate mechanism, the appropriate format for the particular objectives and the particular team that you have within your organization. Again, we've sometimes been asked to drop a completely inexperienced team into a full-on immersive interactive simulation. What you can almost guarantee is that that team will fail, for want of a better phrase. And usually, almost always, that is not the outcome that you're looking for. You'll end up with a demoralized, dispirited, disengaged group of people. That's clearly not a good outcome. And why wouldn't they fail? If they've not been briefed on the plan, if they've not been led through it, to drop them right into in the middle of a live exercise, we are really courting failure through the way that we have set that up. So think about what the right type of exercise might be, as I say, for the organization, for the objectives, and for the crisis team. And there are a range of options. Maybe what you should really be thinking about is a briefing, a workshop on the new crisis management plan, if it is a new crisis management plan. Maybe a way of leading into a more immersive simulation might be initially to run a scenario planning session where you walk through and discuss some of your key risks, maybe as part of a lunchtime session or a half-day workshop. Get people to visualize and walk through how situations might play out, to work out whether you have the resources, the capability, the people you need to actually mount the kind of response that you would like to mount. Maybe move on to a desktop exercise where we start to get the team more engaged with a particular scenario, where there are inputs and the situation moves on and is facilitated, but doesn't have that free flow of the fully interactive simulation. I would suggest it's only when the plan has been properly briefed into your team and that you have a group of people who have, as a minimum, a baseline of understanding and knowledge of crisis management, that you should throw them into the deep end of the fully interactive, immersive simulation. So, right type of exercise at the right time. Crucially, allow sufficient time to prepare. If you want to get the best out of a simulation exercise, it needs to be really well planned. And that's about attention to detail, and that's about having the time to ensure that the entire exercise is realistic and robust. I would suggest a good planning time frame would be 6 weeks. We have on occasions turned simulations round from a standing start in 2 weeks, but that's not a pleasant experience, and it does run the risk of there being glitches or even holes with the exercise, and that's not something that anyone wants. And certainly if you are putting a team through its paces, you don't want them disengaging because there's a flaw with the design of the simulation itself. So don't rush at these things. It's an important part of your crisis management planning program, and so ensure that you allow enough time to prepare for it. On the basis that you have done that, what are some of the key things to think about with regard to planning? Well, firstly, I think it's important to have someone in charge of planning that is a very good project manager, someone who will be responsible for pulling together all of the various elements that go to make up a successful simulation. And here is, in real summary form, some of the key moving parts that you should be considering and developing as part of your planning. There's all of the materials that form part of a simulation. The scenario itself, so the story, Master events list, that's the detailed blow-by-blow account of what's going to happen when. The scripts for the role players who'll be phoning in. Other exercise inputs, whether media articles, social media inputs, incoming emails, etc. And the exercise brief. This is a briefing document for all of those based in the back room or the inject cell, so that people who are not closely involved with the planning of the exercise nevertheless have all the information they require to successfully play their part in the simulation exercise. You need to think about people. Who is going to be the front room facilitation team? Who will be your exercise director? And in the back room or the inject cell, you will require a facilitator and a deputy, role players to perform the role of employees, family members, regulators, government, the media. And talking of the media, potentially one or more reporters and a camera crew to capture those media interviews with your spokesperson. The third area you need to think about are the logistics. Where will the event be held? And you will certainly need at least 2 rooms, the main crisis team room and the inject cell, likely 3 rooms, maybe one of the 3 as a kind of meeting room, a breakout room, or potentially to be used as an interview room. And IT and technology very much need to be part of your planning, and more of that shortly. I talked in that planning slide about the scenario, and what I would really advise you is to choose a scenario which is challenging yet believable. The last thing you want is for your team to disengage from the exercise because they simply do not buy into the scenario itself. And many years ago I was observing, but I hasten to add not leading, a crisis exercise where at a certain point in that simulation another plot twist occurred when the most senior person in the room stood up and said, "This has turned from a simulation into a farce," and he was on the point of walking out. It's an experience which has lived with me ever since, and is one of the reasons why I believe getting the scenario right and not over-egging the pudding is so crucial. So challenging, yes, but it must be believable. Watch out if you have someone in your team who is a budding Spielberg, who is perhaps writing script for Mission Impossible rather than a realistic crisis simulation exercise. So what does make an ideal scenario? Well, clearly it should focus on one of the key risks facing your organization. I know we've got people from a wide range of sectors, from retail through travel, through engineering, through maritime, through gas, mining, financial services. So a realistic and high impact, high likelihood risk area for your particular business, and one which will engage the entire crisis management team. As I say, make it challenging, but not beyond the realms of credibility. What I'd also advise is that ideally the scenario should pose both operational and reputational challenges. So make sure that both elements of crisis management are covered, fixing the actual problem and communicating about it. The other thing that I would say is, again, remember to let the objectives for the exercise drive the content. The scenario is a means to an end. So don't start with a scenario and retrofit it to the objectives. Start with the objectives and then work out what kind of storyline would serve to meet those objectives. Be purposeful in the inputs you create. So we're now moving on from the broad storyline, the kind of play in 3 or 4 acts, and we're going on to think about the specific inputs, the phone calls, the emails, the requests for information, the updated status, those various inputs which will come in during the course of the exercise. Again, that word purposeful. The aim of an input is for it to make the team do, think, know, or say something. There should always be a reason for an input. It is not simply to keep the story going. We need to be posing a range of challenges to the team, and each input should have a specific objective attached to it, whether it's a phone call, an email, a social media comment, or a press article. Some of them should be designed to create a decision point. So some of the best inputs carry a dilemma with them. There is no perfect answer to this particular input, but there are 2 decisions that you could make. Neither of them are great, but a decision needs to be made nevertheless. Other inputs will test the team's information gathering skills, or they may indicate a shift in the center of gravity of the crisis. And it's really interesting to see whether the team in the room notices that center of gravity has changed. By that, I mean that a crisis may start out being about one thing, and then during the course of it, it morphs into something else. Do the team spot that input has taken the crisis in a whole new direction? So be purposeful in the inputs that you create. Scenario plan what the team may do. If you're running the exercise, so you're going to be in the inject cell in the back room, you will be on the receiving end of actions, communication, requests from the crisis management team. So it's not enough simply to plan the inputs that you will put into that team. You also need to pre-predict what the team will do as a result of your inputs. So there's a bit of scenario planning, contingency planning in the planning for a crisis simulation exercise. You want to be at least 1 step ahead of the crisis management team so that you can be slick and well organized in the way that you manage that exercise and in the way that you respond and drive that crisis team. So think about their likely decisions, information requests, and who they may contact as part of your pre-simulation planning. Talking about staying calm and well organized, it is important to assemble a knowledgeable, well organized and unflappable backroom team, the team that will populate that inject cell. Although I've just said it's important to scenario plan, we can't scenario plan everything. So you do need a team of people that are calm, resourceful, flexible, ready to respond to unexpected chains of event. Key roles within that backroom team will be the inject cell manager, the person that is playing the air traffic control room in that inject cell. They particularly need to be unflappable, calm under pressure, well organized, able to see the bigger picture. They would typically be supported by a deputy who can support them in that role. You will have a number of role players, maybe 4, who will be role playing the various different parties who'll be playing into the exercise, as I say, whether they be family members, regulators, government, local community representatives, NGOs, investors, whomever needs to play a part in this exercise. There needs to be a role player taking that particular role. Crucially, in that back room, you need subject matter experts. So let's imagine that you're running a cybersecurity simulation. There must be someone in the back room who understands cybersecurity and your IT infrastructure, because despite our best scenario planning, there will be questions coming from the crisis management team. There will be actions taken by the crisis management team that will require the interpretation and judgment of an expert. So having the right experts in place to make sure that we can respond to the crisis management team and maybe have to slightly finesse the storyline that we were anticipating is crucial. Also in the back room will be one or more journalists typically, and a camera person, as I say, to capture interviews, press conferences, pre-recorded pieces to camera. Moving to the main crisis management team room, so where the crisis management team itself is based, you also require an experienced and confident facilitation team. One or more people with the crisis management team observing, guiding, facilitating, providing feedback. They have to command the respect of the crisis management team. They have to know when to intervene and when to step back, and they need to be vigilant to identify key issues in the team's response so that they can help to lead and facilitate the feedback session, which will take place at the end. So again, if you're looking to identify such a person, I would say the characteristics you're looking for are good judgment, clearly significant levels of experience, and I think emotional intelligence is important as well. They need to be able to read the room and, as I say, know when to step forward and actually ask the team to take a time out and reorientate themselves, and know when actually it makes more sense to take a step back and just let the team get on with it. I mentioned earlier in the planning process, plan logistics and technicalities carefully. You will be requiring phone calls to be made between the inject cell and the main crisis management team room. There will be emails going backwards and forwards between the inject cell and the crisis management team room. There will be media requests coming into the crisis management team. There may be a social media simulator at play where posts are appearing on Twitter or Facebook. All of these provide technological and logistical challenges, and it's important to really plan well for those ahead of time for a number of reasons. First reason is minimizing risk, security. It's always our advice not to use existing normal communication channels, so not to use people's normal email addresses, for example, simply due to the risk of someone pressing the wrong button or seeing the wrong email and perceiving that this is a real crisis and creating an incident out of what was supposed to be a training exercise. Same thing with phones. There's just that danger if people use their normal mobile phones that confusion arises between what is an exercise phone call and what is a real life phone call. So contained communication channels, bespoke channels for the exercise is usually the way to go. The second reason is that technical issues can actually detract from the value that the team get out of the exercise. So if they're really struggling with not having enough phones, or the email doesn't work, or they can't get on the video conferencing kit, that will result in frustration and diminish the value of the learnings from the exercise. What I would say, however, though, is that whilst that second point absolutely is true and you should aim to minimize technical hitches, I think it's also a useful learning that in a crisis, the technical kit and the logistics don't always work perfectly. So actually, having to find some workarounds or getting more comfortable with actually how the video conferencing does work can actually be part of the learnings to stand you in good stead for a real situation. This is an attitudinal thing, really, but I believe it's really important that simulations are treated as rehearsals rather than tests. So the idea is to get the crisis management team to experience in a safe environment what it feels like to experience a real crisis, and to have practice of making decisions, communicating, working together under pressure. And that's the biggest value of the exercise, doing something in a realistic but safe way that gives you that experience to fall back on if a real crisis occurs. So it is experiential learning, it is a rehearsal. If it's set up, or the atmosphere in the room, or even the culture of the organization is, this is a test to see whether you pass or fail, that will not encourage people to throw themselves into the experience, to try new things, to make decisions, to take calculated risks. It will constrain that team, and it will result in a less valuable exercise. So give people the opportunity to practice rather than allowing them to feel that they will pass or fail. Make the experience as near to real life as possible. No exercise can fully prepare the team for a real crisis. But what I also know is that when we talk to organizations who've been through a simulation, they have experienced the pressure for real. It feels intense. It feels like there's a weight of responsibility on their shoulders. It feels like what they are deciding is important. And that's because the simulation that's been created is realistic and as near to real life as possible. So, as far as you can, set up the exercise so that it reflects the way in which your organization actually operates, and include inputs, for example, social media comment, which mimic real life. So if, for example, your corporate headquarters is in Australia and is 11 hours ahead, let's have that reflected within the way that the exercise is constructed. So that Australian head office will need to be role played as part of the exercise, and that time difference needs to be reflected within the exercise. So make the experience as near to your real life and the way that you're organized as possible, without, as I said on the previous slide though, compromising the security of the exercise. So there are limitations, but go as far as you possibly can. I'm moving into the final section of the presentation. I know we've had a couple of questions, but if you have any more, there's probably about up to 10 minutes to post those questions before we move into them in the final 10 minutes of this webinar. So once we are underway, it's important that that backroom team, the people in the inject cell, are flexible and responsive to the actions of the crisis management team. As I mentioned earlier on, you won't be able to predict every decision, action or response of your crisis management team. So having done your scenario planning that I was talking about earlier, it's important that you have people in that room that can think on their feet and are able to flex and adapt to whatever it is that the crisis management team does. And the reason I emphasize this point is because if they're unable to do that, or if you have to simply say, I'm sorry, we've got to park that, or even worse, and I've heard of this happening, you simply can't decide that, that isn't in the scenario, then you lose the crisis management team. They disengage with the exercise, they stop feeling it as though it was real because they've been taken out of the experience. So you need a backroom team that is flexible and responsive and able to think on its feet so that the exercise remains immersive and effective, even when the crisis management team does unexpected things. Allow sufficient time for feedback. At the beginning of this presentation, I talked about the value of a simulation being in both the experience that you can call upon in a real crisis and the learnings which come out of the exercise. And those can be learnings in terms of training needs. They can be learnings in terms of tweaks that need to be made to the crisis management plan. They can be learnings about how we work together as a team, how we communicate, all sorts of things. But it's important that we don't allocate 3 hours for the exercise, for example, and no time for feedback at the end. You'll get that really rich and sometimes raw feedback in the 30 to 45 minutes immediately after the exercise, and you'll get a lot of emotions and feelings being expressed, and it's when that feedback is at its most visceral and at its most authentic. So do make sure that you have, I would suggest, up to an hour allocated at the end of an exercise to gather that hot feedback, the immediate thoughts, feelings and impressions of the people that have played a part in that exercise. I can promise you that the team will be drained, but they will be wanting to get those views and feelings and perceptions out. Never disband the exercise before having teased those initial feelings out. Having teased them out, and typically a feedback report would be developed on the back of an exercise, act swiftly on them. A simulation exercise is a really galvanizing force for people to engage with crisis management, and having secured their engagement and enthusiasm and reiterated that just how important crisis management is, it's important that the learnings are acted on quickly to build on that momentum that has been created. So make changes to the plan quickly, share those changes, set up the next training session, capitalize on the energy and the enthusiasm that would have been created by the exercise. And finally, repeat regularly. I feel like in many ways I am preaching to the converted on this webinar, because if you didn't believe that crisis simulations were important, I don't imagine you would be on this webinar at all. But more than crisis simulations being important, it's not a one-off event. It's not a box to be ticked and it's done. Simulations should take place regularly. I would suggest, depending on your industry and your business, a minimum of once a year. I know organisations that do them far more frequently than that, but any less frequently, and those skills are not being sufficiently exercised, and people are not getting the experience that they need to be able to do and say the right thing under pressure. I come back to our pilot, Kim Green. Final couple of sentences from her. She said, "It's not that pilots are born calm in the face of danger. It's that we review emergency procedures so many times that they come to seem almost routine." As businesses, we can never foresee every crisis, but if you plan for the worst, conduct regular simulation exercises, you will be more ready for action and you won't be left winging it. So that brings the presentation itself to a close. There is time for 3 or 4 questions before we conclude at 2 o'clock latest. And the first question that's come through from Kevin is, what are your thoughts on planned versus unannounced simulations. So a couple of thoughts on that. Unannounced simulations have the real benefit of having that added level of realism that you are exercising a team in a way which is more like real life. They don't know that they're coming for a crisis simulation, so they haven't mugged up on their plans. They haven't, necessarily, ticked all the boxes beforehand. They will be dealing with a situation in an as real way. So there's a real advantage in terms of making it as near to a genuine crisis as you can possibly get. The downside with it is that, well, two or three considerations rather than downsides. Firstly, again, I think it's usually not a good idea to do that with an inexperienced team, maybe doing their first simulation. I really believe in this kind of incremental learning approach. So if your team has not been through a conventional simulation where they actually know that they're coming for a crisis management workshop or something of that kind, I think, literally throwing them into an unannounced simulation can be a challenge too far. I come back to the security issues again. You have to be really careful that you don't allow the fact that this simulation is unannounced to allow it to go out of control and people start making all sorts of phone calls to people that are not involved in the exercise and actually creating a real crisis out of an exercise. So I prefer, on the whole, the announced, the planned simulation, purely because of my job. I am risk averse and I like to take that possibility of something getting out of hand out of the equation. But there is benefit in the unannounced, but I would suggest particularly with experienced teams and with an absolutely crystal clear process for within 2 minutes of the exercise being initiated, the whole team being made very quickly aware this is an exercise, this is not for real. I've had a request rather than a question for a link to the article from Kim, the pilot, and we will certainly provide that, yes, in follow-up to this session. So we will make that available to you. I should also have mentioned that there is an accompanying checklist that goes with this webinar, which we will send out to all participants following the webinar. And if you'd like additional copies of that, please just request that. But fundamentally, all of the slides and additional content that goes behind that are included in the form of a checklist, which we will distribute subsequent to the webinar. I have got a question here, which is, are there ever occasions when you would throw an inexperienced team into a crisis simulation? And I think I have covered that fairly thoroughly, and the answer is usually, almost always not. I have, on a couple of occasions in my career, been asked to do that, and again, we talked about being purposeful in terms of objectives. Actually, on those couple of occasions, there was a purpose to doing that, and the purpose was to shake the crisis management team out of inertia. And actually, I hate to say it, but it was the client's objective for the team to fail, to wake them up and to say, do you know what? We wouldn't cope very well if a crisis was to happen, and we do need to engage in crisis management planning and training. So on the odd occasion, there can be an argument for dropping an inexperienced team into an exercise, but on the whole, it's not a strategy that I would advise. Question from William. In anticipation of a crisis becoming protracted, should you identify and train a crisis management team and also a separate team to keep the normal business working effectively? In simple terms, I would say yes. It's one of the biggest challenges of a protracted crisis, that whilst the, in inverted commas, a team is dealing with the crisis, the day-to-day business, which has to continue, is actually left to wither and go to rack and ruin. So I guess I would say absolutely yes, and maybe add to that by saying I haven't been explicit in saying that crisis simulation should also be for the deputies for the crisis management team as well as the primary members, because you will all know, those of you who've experienced crises for real, crises never happen on the day that you would want them to happen, and they always happen when the very crucial person who is most important to resolving this situation is on holiday or uncontactable or in another part of the world. So absolutely yes, make sure that there's a team available to look after business as usual. Also make sure that the deputies are trained. Question from Rob. Do you recommend using real stakeholder and or media names in a crisis simulation? Yes, we would typically, because it just adds that level of realism and context. Sometimes it's not possible, and for example, when we use the social simulator platform that we use for copyright reasons, we have a platform which is called Social Network, which may look very similar to a social media platform that many of you will use every day, but it can't be called, for example, Facebook, because of course that will be infringing someone's intellectual capital and copyright, and so that is known on the simulator as the social network. Everybody can imagine the kind of platform that we mean by that. But if you operate within the food industry, for example, knowing that we've got the food correspondent calling from the Daily Mail, or that it's a particularly influential trade publication, again, just adds that level of realism and relevance to the exercise. So typically, yes, we would advise using real stakeholder and media names. We've probably got time for one or two more questions. Practical one here. How long should you allow for a simulation exercise? I would say, as a benchmark, half a day. I think if you try and do a full simulation in, let's say, 2 hours, you're really struggling to get the team up to speed, engaged, learning enough from the exercise and have enough time for that debrief. Conversely, whilst we have run day-long exercises and occasionally even longer than that, often I find there's diminishing returns as you spend more and more time in the simulation. So I would suggest, for the team to be active for somewhere between 3 and 5 hours, and for there to be time ahead of time to set up and time allowed at the end for feedback. For me, that would be the perfect time length for an exercise. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions, and it is now 3 minutes to the hour. So we will, as I say, circulate links to this presentation, to a recording of this webinar, to the checklist which accompanies it, and also a link to the article from Kim Green subsequent to this exercise. If there's anything else that you would like to know, you have my contact details there, and you'd be very welcome to give me a ring or drop me an email. We would love to help you run a crisis simulation exercise in 2016 if we're not already scheduled to do so. But as I said at the start, even if we don't, please make it your New Year's resolution to either run one yourselves, or if you really have to, get one of our competitors in to do it for you. It's a critical part of your crisis planning, and without it, you can't have the experience and the capability to be sure that you would do and say the right things under pressure in a crisis. So thank you very much for joining this session. We will be continuing this series of webinars in 2016, and I wish you a productive and crisis-free Tuesday afternoon. Thank you very much.